How about this for a show, then? This is Amelanchier lamarckii, one of the best of the spring-flowering trees, I think. The way these white flowers contrast with the young bronze foliage makes a superb effect. What's more, in the autumn it'll have berries and good leaf colour as well. And I go one step further too and grow a clematis up through the branches, which will give me flower in late summer as well. Well, it's a tree that is quite wonderful but has one snag, and that is that it really prefers an acid soil. But if you took my advice from last week and made yourself a raised bed, then there's no reason at all why you shouldn't grow a tree like this. I'll be continuing with some more advice on raised beds later on in the programme. I've also got some exotic vegetables to plant out and a lawn to sow. But if you want to continue the summer with a show of colour like this, it's time to plant out some perennials. The rose garden is only a couple of years old, but already it's beginning to look quite pleasing. All the way along the path, the plants are tumbling over the edges, and they really do soften that hard line of the paving. But of course, as ever in gardening, you've got to think about continuity, and I've got a bit of a space here, so I'm going to plant in some cerastium right on the edge, and that'll give me a good show of white flowers later on in the year. Now, these are plants, of course, that I raised from seed early on in the year, and I got dozens of plants out of this for the price of a packet of seeds and a little bit of compost. It's really well worthwhile doing. These chrysanthemums were ordered as rooted cuttings last March, and they've grown on very well, and they're now ready for planting out. They're spray varieties, and they will need some support, so the first job is to stick in a cane for each plant, and they want to go in something like 2 foot apart. And then it's just a case of planting them out up against the canes. And just so they don't get battered about in the wind, just a loose tie around them with a bit of soft string. It's always exciting when you get your first tomato set, but I thought I'd messed it up with these plants. They're growing in coconut fibre compost, which grows fine plants, but they do need feeding after about 4 or 5 weeks. Well, I didn't do it, and the tomatoes grew very thin in the stems, went very hard and blue. That's a sure sign of lack of food. Well, I was making my excuses to a visiting commercial tomato grower, but he said to me, well, what's wrong with that? Often commercial growers would do exactly that. They starve the plants of food, and that will encourage them to produce this first set of tomatoes very early. You then whack in the food, the plant will grow away again, and you get a really early crop of tomatoes. Well, this is a new variety called Cherry Wonder, and I'll be growing this in the greenhouse. But for underneath my cloches, I've grown the earliest fruiting bush variety that I know. This one is Red Alert. You know, if you're going to really make use of cloches like these, you've got to get them off one crop as soon as you can and get them on another one. And the early bed here has come on very well. The varieties are quite hardy, so the cloches can come off now and go onto some more exotic plants. It's okay to plant tender vegetables outside now under cloches, but you must make sure that the soil is warm first. So if you haven't got any spare cloches, cover it up first with a bit of polythene to warm it up, about a fortnight before you want to plant, and then make sure that the plants are well watered. Now the tomatoes go in at 18 inches apart, and the French beans, which I've grown in plastic modules, they go in at about a foot apart, and then put the cloche on the top and away they'll grow. Plums and cherries have been really clobbered by the frost this year, and I feel sorry for the commercial growers who can do very little to protect their big freestanding trees. But gardeners can do something about it. If you grow your early flowering fruit up against the fence or a wall, then you can protect them with material like this. This is spun polypropylene material, and you can buy it quite easily at the garden centre, and it will protect the blossoms underneath from a few degrees of frost. Well, Pippa's had a lot of letters from viewers about this, and particularly pest and disease control in fruit. So last autumn she started her pest and disease programme, which has to go on really right the way through the year.
I've heard a lot of really sad stories about fruit trees being attacked by pests, and I've been sent in large numbers of really grotty looking apples. In some cases, the trees produced plenty of blossom, but it was then attacked by the larvae of the various winter moths. And even when fruit did set, the fruitlets and fruits are often attacked by another range of pests. Whenever you want to control this sort of pest, it's a great help if you learn a little bit about its life cycle, what it's getting up to at each stage in the season. That way you can attack it at its most vulnerable. But if you're going to be successful, it's really going to need to be a multi-pronged attack.
In winter and early spring, the females emerge from pupae in the soil, mate with the males, and because they're wingless, they then crawl up the tree trunks, and in early spring lay their eggs. When the eggs hatch, the caterpillars feed on the leaves and buds, and at the end of the summer they stop feeding, climb back down the trunk to pupate in the soil. And here you can interfere really effectively with the life cycle by setting a nasty sticky trap for the females as they try and climb up from the soil over the trunk to lay their eggs up on the top of the tree. You can either use a proprietary fruit tree grease or one of these ready prepared bands, but whatever you do, remember it's got to be in position by the middle of October and stay really good and sticky right through till April. That way you'll trap everything that tries to climb up the trunk. You want to have it at least a foot 18 inches above ground level and just below the point where the main branches start to develop. That way nothing can get past it. And of course what you've got to do is make sure the string here is really tight so that nothing can escape by crawling underneath the band. It's got no option but to crawl over the sticky patch. Once it's well in place, all you do is simply remove this central piece of greaseproof paper, and you'll find underneath it's really covered in a very, very sticky layer, and you peel it back right the way round the trunk and leaving this really sticky patch which will trap all the females. Something else you can think of doing is applying a tar or a winter wash, but these can only be applied when the tree's fully dormant, so there's absolutely no danger of any injury to the young developing buds. So that really only means December to February if you're going to be safe. There's several different formulations available, and all of them help to give a good general clean-up effect. So they'll kill off overwintering disease spores, aphid eggs, and of course they'll also give some control against winter moth. If you're going to winter wash a tree, do make sure that you choose your day very carefully. It's not windy, so that there's no risk of any of the chemical drifting onto nearby plants. And in fact, you can always cover up plants underneath the tree or nearby very precious plants, just in case. And then remember, you too don't want to get the chemical on yourself, so cover up well.
Another pest which can cause quite a bit of damage to fruit is the tortrix moth larvae, but on the whole that's only quite superficial and causes a bit of scarring. Much worse, and certainly a lot more unpleasant, is the codling moth damage. You can see on the outside of the fruit where it starts to make holes in the flesh and it then starts to rot. What it then does is actually start to bore in right the way through to the core, leaving behind it a really nasty trail of droppings and decaying fruit. And when it comes to controlling codling moth, it's particularly important to make sure you have a good understanding of its life cycle.
The females lay their eggs on the fruit and leaves early on in the summer. After about 2 weeks, these hatch and the caterpillars start to tunnel into the fruits. Towards midsummer, they leave the fruits and often go to hide under loose flakes of bark to overwinter in silken cocoons.
You can interfere with the life cycle here by stopping mating. What you can use is a pheromone trap, which is like an open-sided cardboard box. And inside is a large sheet of cardboard covered in a really sticky layer of goo. and on there a small pellet which is impregnated with a pheromone which mimics the scent produced by the female codling moth. This will then lure all the males into the trap and they'll become firmly stuck on the sticky cardboard. This will not only stop the male moths from fertilising the eggs, but in addition it'll give you a good idea of when egg laying is likely to take place, and that way you can get your spray timing really accurate. Spraying is definitely worthwhile and you can use any suitable insecticide like Cybole, but timing's absolutely crucial because you've got to spray at exactly the point when the caterpillars are on the surfaces of the fruit but before they've started to burrow into it. Another way you can interfere with the life cycle is by preventing the caterpillars from overwintering. In about July, if you take a small area of the trunk and scrape off the loose bark, you can then wrap hessian or corrugated cardboard round the trunk. And when the caterpillars move down to try and overwinter under flakes of bark, instead they'll try to overwinter in the hessian or the cardboard. Then later on in the year you can simply take it off and burn it together with all the overwintering caterpillars. So with most of these fruit pests, if you follow the life cycle and plan your attack accordingly, you stand a fairly good chance of getting a good crop of tasty and pest-free fruit.
Last week I started planting a couple of raised beds, one made with railway sleepers and the other with pressure-treated timber. And these were filled with acid soil to enable me to grow a range of acid-loving plants. But you have to bear in mind that these would normally grow on the edge of woodland, so they prefer a little bit of dappled shade. It will certainly be necessary to plant a couple of trees here, and it might be worthwhile providing them with some temporary shade during the summer, perhaps with plastic or with some wooden laths. But it's certainly worth taking a bit of trouble because you can grow plants like this lovely little polygala. Now that will spread right out to cover that area fairly quickly, and it will be smothered with flowers like that for months. But of course, if you've already got a shady spot, then that's the place to build your raised bed. I've got the ideal position here in the shade of these birches, and for an informal spot like this, this is a good material. It's called log roll. You can buy it in the garden centre in various sizes. This one is 1 foot by 8 foot long and costs £17. And it's very easy to install. The first job is just to lay it out in the position you want it. And I think 2 rolls will just about do me here. With raised beds, it's always better if they can be level. They look much better that way, so it's worthwhile just checking with the spirit level. And if it's not level, just put a bit of wood on and bash it down. Better. Bear in mind too that there's going to be quite a weight of soil pushing on this wall, so it needs securing firmly. So use a wide stake where the 2 rolls join together and smaller stakes around at about 2 foot intervals. To acidify the soil, I'm using the same material I used on the other raised beds. This is cocoa shell, a byproduct of the chocolate industry, and it's quite acid. So now that can go in. With the bed filled, it can now be planted and mulched with more of the cocoa shell. The main plants that I want to grow here are the lovely blue Himalayan poppies, the Mechanopsis. They'll look wonderful later on in the summer, and they'll be offset with dwarf rhododendrons and azaleas. The whole bed will look a picture right the way through the summer. Right at the other end of the scale, there's a wonderful range of plants that requires just the opposite conditions. Most of the alpines like full sun and really good drainage. Now, if you've got well-drained soil, you can, of course, grow them on the flats like this very successfully. But if your soil is on the heavy side, then they're ideal subjects for a raised bed. I've made this one out of brick, And note that I've provided some drainage holes in the bottom. This is absolutely vital to make sure that the water doesn't actually hang in the raised bed. And I've filled it up with a very coarse compost. This is made with equal parts of good garden soil, garden compost and really coarse grit. I've also provided on the top here a coping stone so that you can sit down and indulge in the most relaxed gardening you could possibly imagine. And what a wonderful range of plants you can grow. Some of them are really easy. Some of the aubrecias are beautiful, like this one, Elsa Lancaster. Beautiful things, but very, very easy to grow. The variegated aubricia too is a wonderful plant right the way through the season. The little androcysses are probably a little bit more difficult because they do need a little bit of cover from the wet in the winter, but nonetheless they're still perfectly easy to grow, as are the saxifrages. There's a whole range of these. You just put those in and more or less forget all about them. And then there are the real aristocrats. Things like Zaluzianskia, totally unpronounceable names, but what a wonderful plant. But the real star of the show for me is this little Calceolaria. It's got to be worth building a raised bed just to grow that.
Millions of people garden in this country with varying degrees of success. But you might imagine that to create plants like this, especially at this time of the year, you really need ideal growing conditions. A little country cottage with a deep loam. Not if your name's Hester Mallin, you don't. She has spent a lifetime gardening in the East End of London in the most extreme adversity and having to carry compost and plants up 22 floors. All right, well, how would you cope? With no soil at all, a concrete floor, almost constant winds, facing northeast. Hester, there are obviously many constraints to high-rise gardening, but which one of them creates the biggest problem of all?
The wind, without any doubt. I don't even have to hesitate before I answer.
So what do you do about it?
I don't fight it, because nobody can beat a 50, 60, 70 mile an hour gale.
It's as strong as that, is it?
At this height, you must remember we're 22 floors up, and it's the equivalent, if you like, of gardening on a hillside.
Yes.
Totally unprotected.
Now, you have got netting. Is that just to train plants, or is that to break the force of the wind as well?
Yes, absolutely so. Multi-purpose. It trains the plants, it gives them a background, something to support them. It breaks up the force of the wind. It also makes sure that never, ever can a pot go over the side from the garden. Very, very important.
Well, you've obviously become such an expert at combating the elements, Hester. You've become something of an authority on high-rise gardening, haven't you?
Thank you.
Well, I can see you have, because the evidence is around us. An astonishing variety of plants. How many different ones do you have up here?
Throughout the average growing year, if you take into account climbers, trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, herbs, compact vegetables, soft fruits, approximately between 150 to 160 plants in an average 12 months of the year, from, say, spring to spring.
Some of the plants are a bit unexpected for a situation such as this. Choisya Sundance, I mean, even the man who sells that to the public tells me it needs a bit of shelter.
Well, it doesn't get any shelter up here. It has to adapt itself to the tough life. I see no reason why, if you use common sense, you can't grow any plant, no matter how supposedly delicate. In fact, the most tender-seeming plants prove to be terribly tough, and they take it all on the chin.
And there's another one, the winter cherry. Well, it's become a spring cherry.
It's become
now.
A spring cherry, may well become a summer cherry. I left this out in all the snow and the ice, it and its companion. I didn't protect it. It was part of the sort of ongoing experimentation that I do up here all the time and have done for so many years. And you see for yourself, although there's been a little leaf damage, really very little, the cherries continue to appear. It's very, very happy in this most unprepossessing environment.
And I'm interested also, you mentioned when you were running through the plants that you grow, climbers. Now, clearly climbers must be terribly important, making maximum use of your space.
Exactly, using up the walls, such as I have, yes.
And you also mentioned that some of them you're raising yourself.
Yes, from seed. Yes, I grow canary creeper and convolvulus, black-eyed Susan, sweet pea, anything that's an annual and which I can train to go over the perennial plants which I grow, as a matter of course, which live here all the time. And so that for several months in the year, you really do get to use that hackneyed phrase, a living tapestry of multicolored flowers, interweaving one with another.
Well, obviously, raising plants from seed, Hester, is a more economical way of doing it, but you've been pretty economical with your containers as well.
Yes, I have. Whenever I find them, I snap them up. If they're thrown away, then they belong to me, you know, universal property. Or I buy them in junk markets, literally for 10p or 15p, like this one and this one.
But whatever type of container you use, the total weight of the container and the compost must be a consideration.
Yes, it was from the very first with me. One of the things I took into consideration was weight. I had to think of a number of factors in order to make gardening on the 22nd floor succeed. And I made sure from the very beginning that I never used stone, wood, anything that was heavy was out, any brick structure was out.
Now, how can people know what sort of weight their floor will tolerate? Do the people who own these apartment blocks have regulations for this?
I'm sure that they do, and the safest thing to do is always look for something that weighs a feather. If you can do this, no matter how big it is, if you can put it on a hand and there's no weight, then it's suitable. If it weighs your hand down, if it's made of stone, wood, concrete, don't use it. Not on a balcony. It's too unsafe and it isn't worth the venture.
But still, don't forget that a lot of them together can add up. And I always quote to people the fact that a cubic yard of compost weighs a ton.
Yes, and I have another quote to cap that one, and that is a pint of clear water weighs 1.25 pounds, so that when your soil or your compost is saturated, it's much heavier than when it is dry.
And I know you're also very careful about not putting things on the edge of a parapet.
Safety. Primarily safety. That was the very first and the very last of my considerations when I started doing this gardening more than 20 years ago. Is it safe? Will it bother the neighbours? How can I refine an idea? How can I further think out a measure that I want to do so that when I actually do it, I have ironed out of it all possible implications of problems?
It occurs to me that there are many lessons here for people who garden in confined spaces anywhere, and I don't just mean 22 floors up, down at ground level too. What Hester Mallin has achieved here is pretty remarkable, but what a bureaucratic tragedy it is that in so many apartment blocks, the authorities actively discourage gardening by not permitting any plant to show its head above the parapet for fear of sullying the building's appearance.
Well, with the soil warming up and rain in the offing, it's an ideal time for sowing lawns. If your soil is well drained, all you need to do is to incorporate some organic matter and dig or rotivate it in. If your soil is heavy, then you're well advised to work in some really coarse grit. You can buy this from the builders' merchants, and the heavier your soil, then the more grits you need. Don't go for sand, though. Make sure it's really coarse. Then rake over the whole area with the back of the fork. What you're trying to do here is just to get the general levels and to take out the little local lumps and bumps. And from time to time, just step back and squint over the surface, and then you can see how level you've got it. Then the next step is to consolidate it really well. And here I've got a particular problem, because I'm trying to join new grass with old grass. And this is particularly awkward because if this bit sinks, you'll easily be able to see the join. So you've got to go over it very, very carefully, really firming it down well with your heel right the way along the edge. When you've done that, pull some more soil back in and then tread all over it again. And then tread over the whole area with your weight on your heels. A light dressing of fertiliser will give the grass a head start, and you can use either Grow More or something like chicken manure fertiliser, which is organic, but not a lawn weed and feed. And then comes the difficult part, which is the final raking down. You do need to get this level, so work with your rake more or less horizontal and just in front of your feet. I've also raked the soil slightly over the old grass, and that means that the soil is a little bit higher, and that will allow for a certain amount of sinkage. And now you're ready for sowing the seed. That should go on at about 1.5 to 2 ounces per square yard. But I don't think there's any need to mess about with measuring strings and lines and all that sort of thing. Just stand there with your feet about a yard apart, take a handful of seed, lean forward as far as you can, and that's about a square yard. And you'll find that you can hold just about 1.5 to 2 ounces in your hand. And now you can see how much you need to put on, roughly, and then you can use the special patent Barnsdale seed sower. It consists of 2 plastic pots. You put one inside the other, and then just rotate the inside one to make the holes a little smaller. You can always change them if you feel that you're putting too much on. And then fill up with grass seed. And away you go. And when you've done the whole area, then you can rake it in, and the best tool for this is a springtime rake. In a few weeks' time, my new lawn should look as good as this, with any luck. That's if the weather's kind to me, of course. And so far it started off well, because right now it's raining cats and dogs out there, which is, of course, just what a bit of new grass wants. And talking of cats and dogs, thank you very much for the hundreds of letters we've had with your own personal deterrents for keeping the neighbours' cats away. We've had an enormous range of solutions, ranging from the downright violent, lots of shotguns and catapults in there, to the rather more sensible things like orange peel, shredded up and scattered in amongst the plants. Several of you, quite surprisingly, wrote in to say that they found that plastic bottles half filled with water and put in amongst the plants do really keep cats away. And one or two have suggested that a piece of hose pipe laid around is something that the cats will mistake for a snake, and that frightens them off too. Well, we'll be doing a bit of research over the next few weeks, using my own cats as guinea pigs, if that's not Irish. But next week we're joined by top wildlife photographer Heather Angel. She'll be showing us how to make the best use of a camera in the garden. Nigel Coburn will be continuing with his colourful and creative planting schemes, and I'll be back here at Barnsdale, of course, reminding you what you should be doing in the garden next week to make your garden better than mine. Goodbye.